The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the pediatric emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital when the first scream pierced the sterile air. "She's poisoning my baby." The voice belonged to a middle-aged woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer clothes, her manicured finger pointing accusingly at Amira Hassan, a nurse in navy scrubs who stood frozen beside a young boy's hospital bed. Amira's hands trembled as she held the insulin pen she had just used to administer the life-saving medication. The boy, 7-year-old Marcus Williams, lay unconscious on the examination table, his breathing shallow but steady. His blood glucose levels had been dangerously high when he arrived 30 minutes earlier, brought in by his frantic grandmother after he collapsed at school. "Security, security." The woman's voice rose to a shriek that made every head in the busy emergency room turn. "This Muslim woman just injected something into this child. Call 911 now." "Doctor..." Jennifer Martinez looked up from the chart she was reviewing at the nurse's station, her dark eyes narrowing as she processed the commotion. She had been working at St. Mary's for 15 years, and she knew Amira Hassan as one of the most skilled and compassionate nurses on her team. The accusation sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. The woman who had screamed was Karen Whitman, a volunteer coordinator who spent her afternoons at the hospital arranging flower donations and organizing charity events. She stood near the entrance to the pediatric wing, her face flushed with righteous indignation, her voice carrying across the ward with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I saw her with my own eyes," Karen continued, her voice growing more hysterical. "She injected that poor child with something while his family wasn't looking. We need to lock this place down before she hurts anyone else." The emergency room transformed from a place of healing into a scene of chaos in the span of 30 seconds. Security guards rushed in from multiple directions, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Parents clutched their children closer, some moving toward the exits, while others demanded to know what was happening. Amira stood perfectly still beside Marcus's bed, her hijab framing a face that had gone pale with shock and fear. She had been a nurse for 12 years, had saved countless lives, had worked through the pandemic when heroes were desperately needed. Now she found herself at the center of a nightmare that seemed to materialize from nowhere. "Ma'am, step away from the patient," ordered Officer Rodriguez, one of the security guards who had arrived first on the scene. His voice was professional but firm, his hand resting on his radio as he assessed the situation. "I administered insulin," Amira said quietly, her English accented but clear. "The child is diabetic. His blood sugar was over 400. He was going into diabetic ketoacidosis." "Don't listen to her lies." Karen's voice cut through Amira's explanation like a knife. "I heard her speaking in Arabic on the phone earlier. She's probably part of some terrorist cell targeting children." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke, poisoning the atmosphere with their hatred and ignorance. Several parents gasped, some pulling their children toward the exits. Others stood frozen, unsure whether to flee or stay to witness what was unfolding. "Doctor..." Martinez stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. "Officer Rodriguez, Nurse Hassan was following my direct orders. The child presented with severe hyperglycemia, and we administered insulin as per standard emergency protocol. The doctor is covering for her." Karen's voice reached a fever pitch. "They're probably working together. I'm calling 911 right now to report attempted murder." Before anyone could stop her, Karen pulled out her phone and dialed. Her voice carried clearly across the emergency room as she spoke to the dispatcher. "Yes. I need police and FBI at St. Mary's Hospital immediately. A Muslim nurse has just poisoned a child in the emergency room." The hospital staff are trying to cover it up. We need a full lockdown now. The transformation in the emergency room was immediate and devastating. What had been organized chaos became pandemonium. The hospital's emergency protocols kicked in as if responding to an active shooter situation. Doors began sliding shut with electronic clicks that sounded like prison cells closing. The intercom crackled to life with an announcement that sent shivers through every person present. Attention all staff and visitors. The hospital is now under emergency lockdown. No one is permitted to enter or leave the premises until further notice. Please remain calm and stay in your current locations. Amira felt the walls closing in around her as she watched the security guards multiply, their numbers swelling as more personnel arrived. She could see fear and suspicion in the eyes of people she had worked alongside for years. People who suddenly looked at her hijab and saw threat instead of healing. The boy on the bed, Marcus, stirred slightly as his blood sugar began to stabilize, thanks to the insulin Amira had administered. His grandmother, Dorothy Williams, sat beside him holding his small hand. Her weathered face creased with worry that had nothing to do with Karen's accusations. "Excuse me," Dorothy said quietly to Officer Rodriguez. "My grandson is diabetic. He's been since he was 4 years old. That nurse gave him insulin because I told her his numbers were sky high. She saved his life." But Dorothy's words were drowned out by the arrival of the city police, their sirens wailing as they pulled up to the hospital entrance. Through the large windows, everyone could see the flashing red and blue lights painting the afternoon sky in urgent colors. The sight sent another wave of panic through the emergency room. Detective Sarah Chen was the first police officer through the doors, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights as she surveyed the scene. She had responded to domestic disputes, drug busts, and gang violence. But a hospital poisoning was new territory even for her 15 years of experience. "Who's the suspect?" she asked Officer Rodriguez, her voice cutting through the noise. All eyes turned to Amira, who stood beside Marcus's bed like a sentinel guarding her patient. Her hands were clasped in front of her, steady, despite the terror that must have been coursing through her veins. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the patient and put your hands where I can see them," Detective Chen instructed. The words hit Amira like physical blows. In 12 years of nursing, she had never been treated like a criminal. She had held dying children, comforted grieving parents, worked double shifts during flu seasons and natural disasters. Now she was being asked to step away from a patient as if her presence itself were dangerous. "The child needs monitoring," Amira said softly. "His blood glucose is still unstable." "Another nurse can take over," Detective Chen replied, her voice not unkind but inflexible. "Right now, I need you to cooperate with our investigation." As Amira reluctantly stepped away from Marcus's bedside, Karen Whitman positioned herself as the star witness to what she was now calling an attempted murder. She had attracted a small crowd of other volunteers and family members, all hanging on her every word as she recounted her version of events. "I saw her acting suspicious from the moment she walked into the room," Karen declared, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who believed her own lies. She kept looking around to make sure no one was watching, and then she pulled out this syringe and injected something into that poor child's IV line. "Doctor," Martinez felt her blood pressure rising as she listened to Karen's fabricated testimony. She had watched Amira's actions from across the room, had seen the nurse follow proper protocols exactly as she had been trained. The insulin had been drawn from the medication dispenser under electronic surveillance, witnessed by multiple staff members, and administered in full view of the patient's grandmother. "Detective Chen!" "Doctor," Martinez called out, her voice carrying the authority of her position as head of emergency medicine. "I need to speak with you about the medical facts of this case." "In a moment, Doctor," Detective Chen replied. "Right now, I need to secure the scene and interview the witness." The witness. Karen preened under the title, her chest swelling with self-importance as she continued her performance. "I think hospitals need to do better background checks on these people," she said, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that carried perfectly across the room. "You can't be too careful these days with Islamic extremists targeting innocent children." Her words landed like grenades in the charged atmosphere. Several nurses, including Sarah Patel and Maria Santos, both longtime colleagues of Amira's, exchanged horrified glances. They had worked with Amira through countless emergencies, had seen her gentleness with young patients, had shared coffee and stories during long night shifts. The woman Karen was describing bore no resemblance to the colleague they knew and respected. As Detective Chen approached Amira to begin her interrogation, the hospital's chief administrator, Robert Harrison, burst through the doors with the harried look of a man whose peaceful Tuesday had exploded into a public relations nightmare. He had received 3 phone calls in the last 10 minutes, one from the mayor's office, one from the hospital's board of directors, and one from a local news station that had somehow already gotten wind of the story. "What exactly is happening here?" Harrison demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Sir, we're investigating a possible poisoning," Detective Chen replied. "The suspect has been identified as a nurse who allegedly injected an unknown substance into a pediatric patient." The words, "possible poisoning," sent another wave of fear through the emergency room. Parents began demanding to leave with their children. Staff members whispered urgent conversations at the nurses' station, and the atmosphere grew more tense by the minute. Amira found herself sitting in the hospital security office, a cramped room with no windows and fluorescent lighting that made everything look sickly and unreal. Detective Chen sat across from her, a recording device between them on the metal table. "State your full name for the record," Detective Chen began. "Amira Hassan. I am a registered nurse at St. Mary's Hospital." "How long have you worked here?" 4 years at this hospital. I have been a nurse for 12 years total." Detective Chen made notes as she spoke, her pen scratching against the paper in the quiet room. "Tell me what happened with the patient Marcus Williams." Amira took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts despite the surreal nature of the situation. Marcus was brought in by his grandmother approximately 35 minutes ago. He had collapsed at school. Upon examination, his blood glucose level was 420 milligrams per deciliter, which is dangerously high. He was showing signs of diabetic ketoacidosis. "And what did you do?" "I informed Dr. Martinez of the readings. She ordered insulin administration per protocol for pediatric DKA. I drew the medication from the automated dispensing system, verified the dosage with a second nurse, and administered it subcutaneously as ordered." The clinical language felt strange in the tense atmosphere, but Amira found comfort in the familiar medical terminology. These were facts, procedures she had performed hundreds of times, standard care that any emergency nurse would recognize. "The witness says she saw you acting suspiciously, looking around to make sure no one was watching." Amira's brow furrowed. "I was checking the patient's surroundings for safety hazards and ensuring his grandmother was comfortable. It is standard nursing practice to assess the environment before administering medication." Meanwhile, in the main emergency room, Karen was holding court with a growing audience of hospital volunteers, concerned parents, and staff members who had gathered to hear her increasingly elaborate account of the afternoon's events. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw her. Karen continued, her voice gaining confidence with each retelling. She had this look in her eyes. You know, like she was planning something. And the way she kept speaking Arabic on her phone during her break, who knows what she was coordinating with? Doctor, Martinez had heard enough. She approached the group with Marcus's chart in hand, her face set in professional determination. Mrs. Whitman, I need to clarify some facts about this situation. Doctor, I know what I saw. Mrs. Whitman. Doctor, Martinez interrupted firmly. Marcus Williams is a diabetic patient whose blood glucose was over 400 when he arrived. Nurse Hassan administered insulin under my direct orders, following standard emergency protocols. She may have saved this child's life. Karen's face flushed red with anger. Are you accusing me of lying? I saw her inject something suspicious into that child's IV. Marcus doesn't have an IV. Doctor, Martinez replied calmly. The insulin was administered subcutaneously through his arm muscle. Furthermore, the medication was drawn from our secure automated dispensing system, which tracks every dose electronically. The facts should have ended the matter, but Karen had invested too much in her narrative to back down now. She had become the center of attention, the heroic witness who had potentially saved a child's life. Admitting she was wrong would mean acknowledging that her accusations were based not on observation, but on prejudice. The medical establishment protects its own, Karen declared, her voice rising. I've heard about these cases where hospitals cover up malpractice and criminal activity. Just because she's one of your staff doesn't mean she's innocent. In the security office, Detective Chen was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the inconsistencies in the witness's story. She had investigated enough cases to recognize when emotion and prejudice were masquerading as fact. Nurse Hassan, do you have any reason to believe the witness might have a personal issue with you? Amira hesitated, then spoke carefully. Mrs. Whitman has made several comments about my religion and background over the months I have known her. Last week, she asked the volunteer coordinator why the hospital allows people like me to work with children. What exactly did she mean by people like you? Muslim women who wear hijab. She has made comments about our trustworthiness around American children. Detective Chen set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. In her experience, witness credibility often crumbled when personal bias became evident. She made a note to request security footage of the incident and to interview additional witnesses who could provide objective accounts of what had actually occurred. Back in the emergency room, Dorothy Williams was growing increasingly agitated as she watched the circus surrounding her grandson's medical care. Marcus had begun to regain consciousness as his blood sugar stabilized, but the chaos in the room was preventing him from getting the continued monitoring he needed. Excuse me, Dorothy said, standing up from her chair beside Marcus's bed. Her voice was quiet, but carried the authority of someone who had raised 5 children and worked as a teacher for 40 years. Could everyone please lower their voices? My grandson is trying to recover. Karen turned toward Dorothy with exaggerated sympathy. Oh, honey, I am so sorry your grandson was targeted by that woman. Thank goodness I was here to witness what happened and call for help. Dorothy's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Whitman, isn't it? The nurse didn't target my grandson. She saved his life. Marcus is diabetic, and his blood sugar was dangerously high. That nurse gave him exactly what he needed. But I saw her acting suspiciously. You saw her doing her job. Dorothy interrupted firmly. I've been dealing with Marcus's diabetes for 3 years. I know what insulin administration looks like, and that's exactly what she did. The authority in Dorothy's voice began to cut through some of the hysteria that had gripped the emergency room. Several people turned to look at her with new attention, finally hearing from someone who had actually been present during Marcus's treatment. She checked his blood sugar, showed me the reading, explained what she was going to do, and gave him the insulin injection in his arm. Dorothy continued. She was professional, gentle, and thorough. If she hadn't acted quickly, my grandson could have gone into a diabetic coma. Karen's face flushed deeper as her narrative began to unravel under the weight of actual witness testimony. But she had gone too far to retreat now, had committed too publicly to her version of events. "That's what they want you to believe," Karen insisted. "But I know what I saw. And I won't let political correctness prevent me from protecting innocent children from dangerous people." Her words landed in the room like a declaration of war. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the ugly prejudice that had motivated her actions from the beginning. She wasn't a concerned witness protecting a child. She was a bigot, using a medical emergency as an excuse to attack someone she viewed as different and threatening. Dr. Martinez felt her professional composure crack slightly as she listened to Karen's increasingly desperate attempts to justify her actions. "Mrs. Whitman, you've made extremely serious accusations against one of our finest nurses based on religious prejudice. I think it's time you left the emergency room." "You can't silence me," Karen shot back. "I have every right to be here as a hospital volunteer, and I won't be intimidated into staying quiet about what I witnessed." "Actually," came a new voice from across the room, "your volunteer privileges were suspended 5 minutes ago." Everyone turned to see Robert Harrison approaching, his face grim and a folder in his hand. As hospital administrator, he had spent the last hour reviewing Karen's volunteer file and the security footage from the emergency room cameras. "Mrs. Whitman, we need to talk," Harrison continued. "Privately." The crowd began to disperse as the drama's focal point shifted, but the tension remained thick in the air. Parents clutched their children closer, staff members whispered urgent conversations, and the emergency room continued to function under the strange lockdown that had transformed a place of healing into something resembling a crime scene. In the security office, Detective Chen had requested and received the first batch of security footage from the incident. She watched on a small monitor as the events unfolded from multiple camera angles, her trained eye noting details that contradicted Karen's testimony. The footage showed Amira approaching Marcus's bed with a small device in her hand, clearly a blood glucose meter. It showed her speaking with Dorothy Williams, showing her the reading, and explaining the treatment plan. It showed her walking to the medication dispenser, entering her credentials, and drawing the insulin under the electronic supervision of the automated system. Most importantly, it showed Karen Whitman standing near the entrance to the pediatric wing, not close enough to Marcus's bed to see specific details of his treatment, but close enough to see a Muslim woman in scrubs treating a young patient. The timestamp indicated that Karen had made her phone call to 911 less than 2 minutes after Amira had administered the insulin. Hardly enough time to observe suspicious behavior that would warrant such extreme accusations. Detective Chen paused the footage and made notes in her file. This wasn't a case of medical malpractice or attempted poisoning. This was a case of false reporting, potentially motivated by racial and religious bias. In Administrator Harrison's office, Karen sat across from his desk, looking defiant despite the folder of evidence he had placed in front of her. The security footage played on his computer screen, showing her actions and positioning during the incident from multiple angles. "Mrs. Whitman, this footage clearly shows that you were not in a position to observe the specific details of Marcus Williams's treatment." Harrison began. You could not have seen Nurse Hassan acting suspiciously because you were approximately 30 feet away from the patient's bed. Karen's jaw set stubbornly. I know what I saw. What you saw was a Muslim nurse treating a sick child. What you imagined was a terrorist attack. There's a significant difference. The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Karen could admit her mistake, acknowledge her prejudice, and perhaps salvage some shred of dignity from the situation. Or she could double down on her narrative and face the consequences of filing a false police report. I stand by my actions, Karen said finally. If more people were willing to speak up when they see something suspicious, we'd all be safer. Harrison closed the folder with a snap that sounded like a gavel falling. Mrs. Whitman, your volunteer privileges are permanently revoked. Security will escort you from the building, and you are banned from returning to any St. Mary's facility. Furthermore, I'll be recommending that the police pursue charges for filing a false report. The transformation in Karen's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The righteous indignation crumbled, replaced by panic as she realized the consequences of her actions were falling squarely on her shoulders. You can't do this, she protested. I was trying to protect children. This is discrimination against volunteers. This is accountability for false accusations that terrorized our staff and patients. Harrison replied firmly. Your actions today caused unnecessary trauma to a dedicated nurse, disrupted emergency medical care, and created a panic situation that endangered everyone in our facility. Back in the emergency room, word was spreading that the lockdown was being lifted and normal operations were resuming. The heavy atmosphere began to lighten as staff members learned that Amira was being cleared of all accusations and would soon return to work. Detective Chen emerged from the security office with a relieved expression, walking directly to where Dr. Martinez was coordinating the return to normal operations. Doctor, I need to inform you that Nurse Hassan is being released without charges. The evidence clearly supports her actions as appropriate medical treatment. We'll be pursuing charges against Mrs. Whitman for filing a false report. The announcement sent a wave of relief through the emergency room staff. Sarah Patel and Maria Santos embraced each other, tears of relief streaming down their faces. They had watched their colleague being treated like a criminal for doing her job, and the injustice had been almost unbearable to witness. Amira emerged from the security office a few minutes later, her hijab slightly askew and her scrubs wrinkled from the stress of the afternoon. She looked around the emergency room that had been her workplace for 4 years, searching the faces of colleagues and patients to gauge whether she was still welcome in the place where she had dedicated her professional life. Dr. Martinez approached her first, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Amira, I am so sorry for what you went through today. Your actions saved Marcus's life, and everyone here knows that. Is Marcus okay? Amira asked, her first concern still for her patient despite everything she had endured. His blood sugar has stabilized beautifully thanks to your quick intervention. He's going to make a full recovery. As if summoned by their conversation, Dorothy Williams appeared at Amira's side with Marcus, walking slowly beside her. The boy looked pale but alert, his young face curious about the commotion that had surrounded his medical treatment. Nurse Amira, Dorothy said warmly, I wanted Marcus to thank you properly for taking such good care of him today. Marcus looked up at Amira with the direct gaze of childhood, unencumbered by the prejudices and fears that had nearly destroyed her career. Thank you for making me feel better, he said simply. Grandma says you're really good at helping sick kids. The simple honesty of the child's gratitude cut through the afternoon's trauma more effectively than any official vindication could. Amira knelt down to Marcus's eye level, her professional composure finally cracking as tears began to flow down her cheeks. "You are very welcome, Marcus. I hope you feel much better now." "I do," Marcus replied with the resilience of youth. "Can I come back and see you sometime when I'm not sick?" The question broke the last of the tension that had gripped the emergency room for hours. Laughter and conversation resumed as normal operations gradually returned. But the afternoon's events had left scars that would take time to heal. As news of the incident began to spread beyond the hospital walls, the story took on a life of its own. Local news stations picked up the story of religious discrimination in a medical setting. Social media exploded with outrage over Karen's actions, and civil rights organizations began monitoring the case closely. The hospital found itself at the center of a national conversation about prejudice in healthcare settings. Interviews with staff members painted a picture of Amira as a dedicated professional whose only crime had been treating a sick child while Muslim. Karen Whitman, meanwhile, found herself facing a very different kind of publicity. Her name and actions spread across social media platforms, her photograph appearing alongside stories about false reporting and religious discrimination. The woman who had sought to be a hero in her own narrative had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and fear. 3 days after the incident, Karen received formal notification that she was being charged with filing a false police report, a misdemeanor that carried potential fines and jail time. Her employer, a local insurance company where she worked as a customer service representative, terminated her employment after the incident gained national attention. The civic organizations where she volunteered also severed ties, unwilling to associate with someone whose actions had caused such public controversy. The speed with which her life unraveled served as a stark reminder of the consequences that could follow acts of prejudice in the age of social media and instant communication. What had begun as a moment of bias and fear had cascaded into a complete restructuring of her existence. For Amira, the aftermath brought a mixture of vindication and trauma that would take months to fully process. The hospital administration offered her counseling services and additional security training for dealing with hostile situations. Her colleagues rallied around her with support and solidarity. But the experience of being treated as a potential terrorist for doing her job left deep psychological wounds. Dr. Martinez used the incident as an opportunity to implement new training programs focused on cultural competency and bias recognition. The hospital's board of directors approved funding for diversity training for all staff and volunteers, hoping to prevent similar incidents in the future. 6 months later, Marcus Williams returned to St. Mary's Hospital for a routine diabetes checkup. He asked specifically to see Nurse Amira, bringing her a drawing he had made of her, helping him feel better. The simple crayon artwork, which showed 2 stick figures smiling at each other in a hospital room, became a symbol of the healing that was possible even after the deepest wounds of prejudice. The legal proceedings against Karen Whitman concluded with a guilty plea to charges of filing a false police report. She was sentenced to community service at a local interfaith center, where she would spend 200 hours learning about different religious traditions and working alongside people from the communities she had targeted with her prejudice. The civil lawsuit filed by Amira and her attorneys resulted in a substantial settlement from the city police department, which acknowledged that the response to Karen's false report had been excessive and traumatic. The money would help cover Amira's counseling costs and provide financial security while she recovered from the psychological impact of the incident. Perhaps more importantly, the incident sparked policy changes in how emergency calls involving potential hate crimes were handled. New protocols required additional verification and investigation before implementing lockdown procedures in medical facilities. helping to prevent future incidents where prejudice could masquerade as public safety concerns. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital returned to its normal rhythm of healing and hope. But the lessons of that traumatic afternoon remained embedded in the culture of the institution. Staff members were more aware of the potential for bias in their interactions, more protective of colleagues who might face discrimination, and more committed to ensuring that their workplace remained a safe haven for healing, regardless of a patient's or colleague's background. Amira continued working as a pediatric nurse, her dedication to her young patients unchanged, despite the trauma she had endured. She became an advocate for healthcare workers facing discrimination, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the importance of protecting medical professionals from prejudice and false accusations. The story of what happened that day at St. Mary's Hospital spread far beyond the local community, becoming a case study in schools of nursing, medical ethics classes, and diversity training programs across the country. It served as a powerful reminder that prejudice could strike anywhere, even in places dedicated to healing and care. Years later, when Marcus Williams graduated from high school, he wrote a college application essay about the day a Muslim nurse saved his life and taught him about courage in the face of hatred. He credited that experience with inspiring his decision to pursue a career in medicine, hoping to create healing spaces where prejudice had no power to harm. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital continues to serve its community, treating patients of all backgrounds with the same dedication and skill that Amira Hassan demonstrated on that frightening afternoon. The walls have been repainted, new equipment has been installed, and staff members have come and gone. But the legacy of what happened there remains. It stands as a testament to the truth that healing is colorblind, that medical expertise transcends religious differences, and that courage in the face of prejudice can transform communities. Most importantly, it reminds us that sometimes the most heroic act is simply doing your job with compassion and skill, regardless of the hatred that others might direct toward you. In the end, the story of Karen's false accusations became a story of triumph over prejudice, of truth prevailing over fear, and of a community learning to recognize and reject the poison of hatred in all its forms. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital returned to its mission of healing, stronger and more committed than ever to treating every patient with dignity and every colleague with respect. The fluorescent lights still hum overhead in the pediatric emergency room, casting the same sterile glow they did on that traumatic afternoon. But now, they illuminate a space where diversity is celebrated rather than feared, where differences are seen as strengths rather than threats, and where the only thing that matters when a child needs help is the skill and compassion of the medical professionals dedicated to saving lives.